The sound came first, a sharp crack that echoed through Barracks Delta like a gunshot, followed by a scream that cut through 200 sleeping soldiers like a blade through silence. In the space between heartbeats, before anyone could process what they were hearing, before feet could hit the floor or hands could reach for weapons, it was already over. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid lay on the polished linoleum, his right hand twisted at an angle that made seasoned infantry veterans wince, his face white with shock and pain. Standing over him, her posture as calm as if she'd just finished folding laundry, was a woman most of them had never bothered to learn the name of. What happened in those 3 seconds would rewrite everything they thought they knew about power, about assumptions, and about the quiet logistics clerk who had been invisible among them for 2 weeks. But to understand how it ended, you need to know how it began. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories that honor quiet sacrifice, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. 14 days earlier, the transport truck had rumbled through the main gate of Fort Braxton, carrying its usual cargo of transfers, reassignments, and administrative personnel. The dust cloud it kicked up settled over everything like a fine coating of bureaucratic inevitability. Another day, another batch of people the Army needed to move from one place to another for reasons that made sense to someone far above the pay grade of anyone who actually had to deal with the consequences. Among the passengers was Captain Elena Vasquez, though the name on her temporary orders read simply Eve Vasquez, Logistics Coordination Specialist. She wore the standard ACU uniform with subdued rank insignia, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it looked painful. Her duffel bag was standard issue, worn but well maintained. Her boots were properly shined but not obsessively so. Everything about her presentation suggested someone who followed regulations precisely without trying to impress anyone. She was 34, though she could have passed for younger if not for something in her eyes, a stillness that came from seeing things that aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her hands, when she signed the check-in paperwork, moved with the kind of controlled precision that most people attributed to military training. Those who looked closely might have noticed the faint scarring across her knuckles, the calluses in unusual places, the way her fingers found the pen with surgical accuracy. But most people didn't look closely. That was exactly how she preferred it. Fort Braxton was a sprawling installation in North Carolina, home to the 82nd Airborne Division, and more elite units than appeared on any public organizational chart. 40,000 personnel moved through its gates daily, a small city's worth of soldiers, support staff, contractors, and the endless stream of people required to keep a modern military base functioning. It was the kind of place where individuals disappeared into the machinery of the institution, where specialization created silos, where someone could work for weeks without anyone questioning exactly what they did or why they were there. Elena had been assigned to Barracks Delta, a massive concrete structure that housed nearly 300 soldiers from various support units. Logistics, communications, intelligence analysis, maintenance, the unglamorous but essential work that kept the 82nd ready to deploy anywhere in the world on 18 hours' notice. Her room was on the 2nd floor, a small space she shared with a cheerful communications specialist named Sarah Kim, who had been at Braxton for 6 months and was eager to help the new transfer settle in. "You'll like it here," Sarah had said on Elena's first morning, her voice carrying that forced optimism of someone trying to convince herself as much as her listener. "The work's steady, the chow's not terrible, and most people keep to themselves. Just don't let the infantry guys get under your skin. Some of them think support personnel are second-class soldiers." Elena had nodded politely, unpacking her few belongings with methodical efficiency. A laptop secured with locks that suggested classified access, a small collection of books, mostly technical manuals, and a few novels that looked well read. A photograph of herself with an older woman who shared her features but had kind eyes and a warm smile. Her mother, Sarah assumed, though Elena offered no explanation. Everything was arranged with the kind of precise organization that spoke to years of living out of duffel bags and temporary assignments. "What kind of logistics work did you do before this?" Sarah had asked, making conversation while Elena arranged her uniforms in the wall locker with mathematical precision. "Coordination," Elena replied, her tone neutral but not unfriendly, making sure things got where they needed to be when they needed to be there. It was not exactly an answer, but Sarah had been in the army long enough to recognize when someone was deflecting without being rude about it. Some people were private, some had jobs they couldn't discuss in detail. Elena seemed to fall into both categories, so Sarah stopped asking questions and started pointing out practical information instead. Where to get the best coffee, which dining facility had the shortest lines, how to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of post-administration. Elena absorbed it all with the kind of focused attention that made Sarah feel like she was briefing a superior officer, though Elena's actual rank was only captain. There was something about the way she processed information, the follow-up questions she asked, the mental notes she clearly made about procedures and personalities, that suggested someone accustomed to operating in complex environments where small details could have significant consequences. That first week, Elena became functionally invisible. She reported to the logistics office each morning at precisely 0700, worked steadily through the day processing requisitions and coordinating shipments, and returned to the barracks each evening without drawing attention to herself. She ate meals quickly and alone, usually at tables that offered clear sightlines to all entrances. She exercised during off-peak hours when the gym was nearly empty, running on treadmills that faced away from the windows and lifting weights with a focus that discouraged conversation. The few times other soldiers tried to engage her in casual conversation, she responded politely but briefly, offering just enough social interaction to avoid seeming antisocial while making it clear she wasn't seeking friendship. She was professional but distant, competent but unremarkable, present but somehow separate from the social dynamics that defined barracks life. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid noticed her during her second week, though not for reasons she would have appreciated. Reid was 28, 6 years in the Army, with the kind of swagger that came from being just successful enough to think he understood how the world worked, but not experienced enough to have learned humility from being wrong. He was a squad leader in an infantry unit, rotating back from a deployment that had been mostly uneventful, long enough to feel important, not dangerous enough to teach wisdom. Reid had the misfortune of belonging to that particular subspecies of NCO who confused authority with dominance, who interpreted his chevrons as permission to test boundaries rather than responsibility to maintain standards. He was the kind of leader who made soldiers count their blessings when they transferred to different units, who created problems that higher-ranking NCOs had to spend time fixing, who somehow never faced serious consequences because he was just competent enough at his actual job to make removing him more trouble than it seemed worth. He first saw Elena in the dining facility on a Thursday evening, sitting alone with a book propped against her water bottle, methodically working through her meal while reading what appeared to be a technical manual of some kind. Everything about her posture suggested someone who preferred solitude, who had chosen that table specifically because it was away from the main traffic flow, who was clearly not seeking interaction. To Reid, this looked like an opportunity rather than a preference. "Hey there," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without invitation, his tray hitting the table with casual presumption. "I'm Marcus Reid. Don't think we've met." Elena looked up from her book, her expression neutral but not welcoming. "Captain Vasquez," she replied, then immediately returned her attention to the page. Reid's eyes flicked to her rank insignia, and his expression shifted slightly. She outranked him, but barely, and he was infantry, while she was clearly support. In his mental calculus, that made them roughly equivalent, especially in a social setting where formal military courtesy could be relaxed. "What brings you to beautiful Fort Braxton?" he continued, undeterred by her obvious lack of interest in conversation. "Transfer, deployment rotation, or just lucky enough to get assigned to paradise?" "Work," Elena said without looking up. The single word carried a tone that most people would have recognized as a polite request to be left alone. Reid either didn't recognize it or chose to ignore it. "Right, but what kind of work? I mean, you're logistics, right? Got to be more specific than that. Supply chain management, transportation coordination, equipment acquisition?" Elena finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. There was something in her gaze that made Reid feel unexpectedly uncomfortable, though he couldn't have articulated why. The kind that keeps people like you supplied with everything you need to do your job, she said quietly. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, even a diplomatic one that acknowledged his importance while deflecting his question. But Reid heard something else in it, dismissal perhaps, or the kind of polite condescension that officers sometimes used when they wanted to remind enlisted personnel of the hierarchy without being obvious about it. People like me, he repeated, his tone shifting slightly. You mean infantry? The guys who actually do the fighting while support sits in air-conditioned offices pushing papers around? Elena closed her book carefully, marking her place with precise attention before setting it down on the table. I mean soldiers who have specific mission requirements that need to be met through coordinated logistics efforts, she said, her voice remaining level. If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish tonight. She stood, gathered her tray and book, and walked away without another word, leaving Reid sitting alone at the table with the distinct feeling that he had just been dismissed by someone who thought she was better than him. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A brief social interaction that hadn't gone well, easily forgotten in the rush of military routine. But Reid was not most people. He was someone who interpreted professional courtesy as personal slight, who confused respect for rank with respect for person, who had spent 6 years in the army without learning the difference between confidence and arrogance. Over the next few days, he made it his business to pay attention to Elena Vasquez. He noticed that she ate alone, exercised alone, worked late hours when most people were relaxing. He noticed that she seemed to avoid social situations, that she never joined the informal groups that gathered in common areas, that she had developed no apparent friendships despite being at Braxton for 2 weeks. To Reid, this looked like someone who thought she was too good for everyone else, someone who needed to be brought down to earth, someone who would benefit from learning that rank didn't make you special if you couldn't back it up when it mattered. He began making comments. Nothing that could be called insubordination, nothing that violated regulations, just small observations delivered within earshot when he knew she could hear them. Comments about support personnel who thought they were combat soldiers, observations about the difference between real military experience and desk jobs. Casual remarks about officers who had never been tested in situations that actually mattered. Elena ignored them completely, which only convinced Reid that he was right about her character. Someone with legitimate confidence would have confronted him, or at least acknowledged the provocation. Her silence confirmed that she was exactly what he had suspected, someone hiding behind rank insignia because she knew she couldn't handle direct confrontation. The escalation was gradual but inevitable. Reid's comments became more pointed, his presence around her more frequent and deliberate. He would position himself where she had to see him, where she had to hear his observations about support personnel who acted above their station, where she had to choose between confronting him and continuing to avoid the conflict. Elena chose avoidance, which Reid interpreted as weakness. He had no way of knowing that she was making the same choice she had made in a dozen other assignments, in a dozen other places where staying invisible was more important than defending her ego. He had no way of knowing that her silence came not from inability to respond, but from years of training that had taught her to save her strength for battles that actually mattered. He had no way of knowing that he was making the most dangerous mistake of his military career, mistaking restraint for vulnerability, confusing professional discipline with personal weakness. The confrontation, when it finally came, would surprise everyone except Elena. She had seen it building for days, had recognized the pattern that always preceded these moments, had prepared herself for the inevitable moment when someone's need to prove their dominance would overcome their sense of self-preservation. What she hadn't expected was that it would happen in front of 220 witnesses in the middle of the night, in a place where her response would be seen by more people than had noticed her arrival, her work, or her weeks of careful invisibility. But that moment was still 3 days away, and for now, Elena Vasquez continued to exist in the space she had carved out for herself, present but unnoticed, competent but unremarkable, professional but separate from the social currents that defined life in Barracks Delta. She completed her daily tasks with quiet efficiency, processed requisitions with mathematical precision, and returned to her small room each evening to read technical manuals under the light of her desk lamp. Sarah Kim tried occasionally to draw her into conversation, but had learned to respect her privacy. The other soldiers in their corridor nodded politely when they passed in the hallway, but made no effort to include her in their social circles. Everyone assumed she was temporary, a short-term assignment who would rotate out soon enough that getting to know her wasn't worth the effort. Everyone assumed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a logistics officer doing a routine job in a routine way at a routine installation. Everyone was wrong, but they wouldn't discover how wrong they were until Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid made the mistake of grabbing her collar in front of 220 witnesses, and Elena Vasquez stopped being invisible in a way that would change everything. The quiet woman who processed shipping manifests and coordinated supply chains was about to demonstrate that some people chose to be unremarkable not because they couldn't be memorable, but because being memorable came with consequences that most people were not prepared to handle. The alarm came at 3:47 hours on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the barracks like a scream in a cathedral. Elena jerked awake instantly, her body responding to the sound with the kind of automatic readiness that came from years of sleeping light in places where alarms meant life or death. Around her, 220 soldiers were stumbling out of their bunks, confusion mixing with trained response as emergency lights bathed everything in harsh red. "Attention all personnel," the voice crackled over the intercom system, tinged with static and urgency. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Chemical leak detected in building 447. Immediate evacuation protocol is in effect. All personnel report to designated assembly areas. Hazmat teams are responding." Elena was already moving, her feet hitting the floor as her mind automatically shifted into crisis mode. Building 447. She knew it instantly from her 2 weeks of memorizing base layouts in logistics networks. The chemical storage facility that housed cleaning supplies, maintenance solvents, and industrial compounds used across the installation. A leak there could mean anything from minor irritation to catastrophic exposure, depending on what had breached containment. Around her, the barracks erupted into controlled chaos, soldiers pulling on uniforms, grabbing gear, moving toward exits with the kind of organized urgency that came from endless drills. NCOs shouting instructions, trying to maintain order while processing information that was coming in fragments over radio channels that crackled with competing traffic. "Where's the assembly area?" someone called out. "Grid 347, south of the commissary," came a reply, though Elena could hear uncertainty in the voice. She frowned, her mental map of the base automatically calculating wind patterns and topography. Grid 347 was downwind from building 447, positioned exactly where airborne contaminants would drift if the wind maintained its current southeastern pattern. Whoever had designated that assembly point had either made a critical error or was working with outdated meteorological data. "That's wrong," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. But Sarah Kim heard her, pausing in the act of lacing her boots. "What's wrong?" Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing the consequences of speaking up against the danger of staying silent. "The assembly area. Grid 347 is downwind. If there's really a chemical leak, we'd be moving people directly into the contamination plume." Sarah's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Elena's mind ran through the calculations automatically, wind speed and direction from the weather briefing she'd read before bed, the topographical features that would channel airflow, the likely dispersal patterns of industrial chemicals in current atmospheric conditions. "Positive. Shouldn't we tell someone?" Elena looked toward the hallway where soldiers were streaming past their door, following orders that would put them directly in harm's way. She could hear NCOs repeating the assembly area designation, could see the trust in people's faces as they followed instructions that someone in authority had given them. The smart move was to follow orders. To trust that someone higher up the chain had better information, better training, better authority to make these decisions, to stay invisible, stay unremarkable, let someone else handle the crisis while she blended into the crowd of evacuating personnel. But Elena had spent too many years in situations where staying quiet meant people died, where deference to authority became complicity in disaster, where the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure came down to someone being willing to speak truth to power regardless of personal consequences. She grabbed Sarah's arm as her roommate started toward the door. Listen to me very carefully. The official assembly area is wrong. Grid 347 will put people directly downwind of the leak. We need to get everyone to move to Grid 289 instead, the athletic fields north of the commissary. That's upwind and elevated. Sarah stared at her, confusion mixing with growing alarm. But the orders are wrong. Elena's voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that came from having made similar calculations under pressure in places where mistakes were measured in body counts. And if people follow them, they're going to be breathing contaminated air for however long it takes someone to realize the mistake. Before Sarah could respond, Elena was moving, pushing through the stream of soldiers in the hallway with purposeful determination. She could hear Sarah calling her name behind her, but there was no time for explanation, no time for convincing people who had been trained to follow orders without question. The emergency command post had been set up in the barracks' main lobby, a space normally used for informal gatherings, now transformed into a hub of military efficiency. 3 NCOs worked radios and phones, coordinating with base operations, emergency services, and unit commanders. Maps covered a fold-out table, red markers indicating wind direction and contamination zones based on preliminary assessments. Elena approached the senior NCO, a sergeant first class named Morrison, who wore the kind of focused expression that came from being suddenly responsible for hundreds of lives. He was speaking rapidly into a handheld radio, confirming evacuation procedures with someone at base headquarters. Roger, all personnel proceeding to Grid 347 as directed. ETA 10 minutes for full accountability. Sergeant First Class Morrison. Elena's voice cut through his transmission with quiet authority. Morrison looked up, irritation flashing across his face at being interrupted during a crisis communication. His eyes took in her rank insignia, and his expression shifted slightly to professional courtesy, though the irritation remained. "Ma'am, I'm coordinating with base ops right now. If you could—" "Grid 347 is downwind of the leak source," Elena said, stepping closer to the map table and pointing to the assembly area that had been circled in red marker. "Current wind is from the northwest at 12 knots. Chemical dispersal from Building 447 will follow the topographical channel here." Her finger traced the line across the map, directly over the designated assembly area. Morrison's radio crackled with another transmission, but he ignored it, staring at Elena with the expression of someone trying to process unexpected information under pressure. "Ma'am, those coordinates came directly from base ops. They have meteorological data and hazmat expertise." "Their meteorological data is wrong." Elena's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "I've been tracking weather patterns for 2 weeks as part of logistics coordination. Wind shifted from northwest to southeast at 0200. Base ops is likely working with the evening forecast, not current conditions." She pointed to another area on the map, northeast of the contamination zone. Grid 289, the athletic fields, elevated upwind, clear sightlines for accountability. That's where people need to be. Morrison stared at her, his mind clearly racing. He was being asked to contradict orders from higher authority based on the assessment of a logistics officer he'd never met in the middle of a crisis where mistakes could be catastrophic in either direction. If he followed her recommendation and she was wrong, he'd face discipline for failing to follow emergency procedures. If he ignored her and she was right, people could be seriously injured. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't have authority to change assembly areas without clearance from—" The radio in his hand crackled with urgent transmission. Command post, this is Hazmat 1. We've got eyes on the leak source. Multiple containers breached, chemical cloud visible. Wind is carrying contamination southeast toward the commissary area. Repeat, contamination is moving southeast." Morrison went white. He stared at Elena, then at the map, then back at Elena. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How long until everyone reaches Grid 347? Elena asked, her voice still calm despite the adrenaline that was now coursing through her system. Morrison looked at his watch, his hand visibly shaking. 6 minutes, maybe 7. Elena moved around the table, positioning herself where she could see all the communication equipment. "Do you have direct comms with the units that are moving?" "Yes, ma'am, but Then redirect them, now, before they walk into a chemical cloud. Morrison hesitated for another precious second, then grabbed his radio with sudden determination. All units, this is Barracks Delta Command. Change of assembly area, change of assembly area. Proceed to Grid 289. Repeat Grid 289, athletic fields north of commissary. Do not, repeat, do not, proceed to Grid 347. The response was immediate confusion. Voices overlapping on multiple channels, unit leaders asking for confirmation, questions about who had authority to change emergency procedures, demands for clarification that Morrison couldn't answer without explaining that he was following the advice of a logistics officer who had been at Braxton for exactly 2 weeks. "Sir, this is 3rd Platoon. Confirm change to Grid 289? "Sir, we're 3 minutes from Grid 347. Are you sure about this redirect?" "Command, this is 1st Sergeant Williams. Who authorized the assembly area change?" Morrison looked at Elena desperately. She took the radio from his hand without asking permission. "All units, this is Captain Vasquez," she said, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made people stop asking questions and start following directions. "Chemical dispersal modeling indicates imminent contamination of Grid 347. Grid 289 is confirmed safe. Move your people now." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The radio went silent for a moment, then erupted with confirmations. Something in Elena's tone, the precise confidence with which she delivered the tactical assessment, had cut through the confusion and doubt. Unit leaders acknowledged the redirect, reported changing course, confirmed that their soldiers were moving to the new location. Morrison stared at Elena with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, how did you—" "Chemical dispersal modeling isn't complicated if you have accurate meteorological data and topographical analysis," Elena said, already moving toward the door. "But someone needs to verify that everyone got the message. 3rd Platoon sounded like they were already committed to the original route." She was out the door before Morrison could respond, moving through the barracks corridors with the kind of purposeful urgency that made people step aside without conscious thought. Behind her, she could hear Morrison trying to regain control of his command post, coordinating with base ops, explaining the situation to increasingly senior officers who wanted to know exactly what was happening and why. Elena burst through the barracks exit into the pre-dawn darkness, where emergency lights cast everything in harsh relief. She could see clusters of soldiers moving toward the northeast, following the redirect to Grid 289. But in the distance, visible as dark shapes against the horizon, one group was still moving southeast toward the original assembly area. 3rd Platoon. Elena broke into a run, her boots hitting the asphalt with rhythmic precision. She had maybe 4 minutes before those soldiers reached the contamination zone, maybe 5 if they moved slowly in the darkness. The distance was approximately 800 meters across terrain that included 2 chain-link fences, a drainage ditch, and a section of rough ground marked with warning signs about training ordnance. She ran like her life depended on it, because 36 lives actually did. The first fence was 8 feet high, topped with concertina wire. Elena hit it at full speed, her hands finding purchase on the chain link, her body moving up and over with fluid efficiency. She cleared the concertina wire with inches to spare, landed in a controlled roll, and kept running without missing a stride. The drainage ditch was 12 feet across and 4 feet deep, filled with standing water that reflected the emergency lights like black glass. Elena leaped it without slowing, her jump carrying her to the opposite bank where she caught herself on her hands, rolled to absorb the impact, and continued running. The rough ground was littered with training debris, concrete barriers, razor wire, abandoned equipment that created a maze of obstacles in the darkness. Elena navigated it from memory, her mental map of the base guiding her through the safest route at maximum speed. She could feel her heart rate climbing, could taste the metallic edge of extreme exertion, but her breathing remained controlled, her pace sustainable. 3rd Platoon came into view as she crested a small rise. 36 soldiers in loose formation, moving steadily toward Grid 347 under the leadership of a staff sergeant who was checking his GPS unit and confirming their route. They were 2 minutes from the assembly area, maybe 3. close enough that she could hear their voices, the casual conversation of soldiers who thought they were following routine procedures. "Third platoon, halt!" Elena's voice carried across the distance with parade ground authority. The formation stopped immediately, 36 heads turning toward the figure running toward them out of the darkness. The staff, Sergeant, a competent-looking NCO named Peterson, stepped forward with his weapon at low ready, not threatening, but ready to respond to whatever crisis had sent someone running across rough terrain in the middle of an emergency evacuation. Elena closed the distance in 30 seconds, arriving at the formation with her breathing controlled despite the run that should have left her gasping. "Staff Sergeant Peterson?" "Yes, ma'am." Peterson's voice was professional but confused. "Captain, are you injured? Do you need medical?" "You need to redirect to grid 289 immediately. The original assembly area is contaminated." Peterson frowned, his tactical radio crackling with traffic from other units. "Ma'am, I haven't received any redirect orders. Our instructions are grid 347, and I've got GPS confirmation we're almost there." Elena pointed southeast, where a faint haze was visible in the emergency lighting, the leading edge of the chemical cloud that was drifting toward grid 347 exactly as she had predicted. "Look at the horizon, Staff Sergeant. That's not fog." Peterson followed her gesture, his expression changing as he registered what he was seeing. The haze was subtle, barely visible, but definitely there, and it was moving. "Jesus," he breathed. "How long do we have?" Elena looked at the wind direction indicators, emergency flags that were snapping steadily from the northwest, and calculated dispersal speed based on observed movement of the chemical cloud. 3 minutes, maybe 4, before that cloud reaches grid 347. If you move fast, you can reach grid 289 in 6 minutes. Peterson was already turning to his platoon, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had just realized how close they had come to walking into disaster. "Listen up. Change of plans. We're moving to grid 289, athletic fields north of commissary. Double time, people. Move like your lives depend on it." The platoon responded instantly, formation dissolving into rapid movement toward the northeast. Peterson fell into step beside Elena as they moved, his radio crackling with confirmation traffic from other units that had successfully made the redirect. "Ma'am," he said quietly as they ran, "how did you know? About the contamination drift, about the timing. How did you know?" Elena glanced at him, weighing how much to reveal. "Meteorological analysis, chemical dispersal modeling, standard hazmat assessment protocols." Peterson nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Logistics officers didn't typically have that kind of specialized knowledge, didn't usually run across rough terrain in the middle of crisis responses, didn't give tactical orders with the kind of absolute confidence that made veteran NCOs follow without question. But before he could ask follow-up questions, they reached grid 289, where the rest of the evacuated personnel had assembled in organized formations. Accountability was proceeding smoothly. Medics were standing by for anyone who might have been exposed before the evacuation, and emergency coordinators were setting up communication hubs to coordinate with hazmat teams. Elena slipped into the crowd of soldiers, becoming invisible again among hundreds of people in identical uniforms. She had done what needed to be done, prevented what could have been a mass casualty incident, demonstrated expertise that she wasn't supposed to have in ways that people would remember. But as she stood in formation waiting for the all clear, she could feel eyes on her. Soldiers who had seen her take charge, NCOs who had heard her voice on the radio, officers who were wondering how a logistics captain had known things that emergency management specialists had missed. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid was among them, standing 3 rows behind her in the formation, staring at the back of her head with an expression that mixed confusion with growing suspicion. He had been in the group that followed the redirect, had heard Elena's voice on the radio, had watched her emerge from the darkness like something out of an action movie. It didn't fit with his assessment of her character. Logistics officers didn't run through obstacle courses in the dark. Support personnel didn't take charge of crisis situations. People who avoided confrontation didn't give orders to infantry NCOs with the kind of voice that made everyone listen. Either he had been completely wrong about Elena Vasquez, or there was something about her that he didn't understand. Something that meant she wasn't what she appeared to be, wasn't who she claimed to be, wasn't just a logistics officer who processed shipping manifests and coordinated supply chains. Reid was not smart enough to leave those questions alone. He was not wise enough to accept that some people had backgrounds they didn't discuss, knowledge they didn't advertise, capabilities they only revealed when lives depended on it. He was exactly the kind of person who would see Elena's competence as a challenge rather than a lesson, who would interpret her expertise as deception rather than discretion, who would decide that someone who could do what she had just done needed to be tested further. The chemical leak was contained by dawn. Hazmat teams confirmed that the contamination had drifted exactly as Elena had predicted, that Grid 347 would have exposed hundreds of soldiers to industrial solvents that could have caused respiratory damage, chemical burns, and long-term health complications. The redirect had prevented a disaster, and the precision of Elena's assessment had impressed everyone from emergency coordinators to base commanders. There would be commendations, after-action reports, lessons-learned briefings that would change emergency procedures for future incidents. But Elena would not be mentioned in any of them. By the time official reports were written, her role in the crisis response had been quietly transferred to other names, other explanations, other people who were supposed to have that kind of expertise. She returned to her regular duties the next day, as if nothing had happened, processing requisitions and coordinating shipments with the same quiet efficiency she had shown since arriving. Most people assumed someone else had been responsible for the tactical assessment that had saved them. The few who remembered her involvement convinced themselves they had been mistaken, that stress and confusion had made them misremember who had said what. But Marcus Reid remembered everything, and he was determined to find out exactly who Elena Vasquez really was, and why someone with her capabilities was pretending to be something she obviously wasn't. The confrontation was now inevitable, and when it came, it would reveal more than either of them anticipated. The questions started the next morning during PT formation, subtle probes disguised as casual conversation. Reid had spent the night thinking about what he had witnessed, running through scenarios in his mind, trying to reconcile the woman who had taken charge during the chemical crisis with the logistics officer who had avoided confrontation for 2 weeks. "Hell of a thing last night," he said to Staff Sergeant Peterson during their cool-down stretches. "Good thing someone knew enough to redirect everyone before we walked into that contamination cloud." Peterson nodded, toweling sweat from his face. "Yeah, Captain Vasquez called it perfectly. Don't know how she figured out the dispersal pattern so fast, but she probably saved a lot of people from getting hurt." Reid's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his stomach. "Vasquez, the logistics officer from Barracks Delta? That's the one. Ran across rough terrain in the dark to warn us we were heading into contaminated air. Moved like she'd done it before, real professional." Reid processed this information, fitting it into his growing theory about Elena's true background. "What did she say exactly? When she redirected you?" Peterson thought for a moment. "Something about meteorological analysis and chemical dispersal modeling, standard hazmat assessment protocols, knew exactly how long we had before the contamination reached us, exactly where we needed to go instead." "Hazmat assessment protocols," Reid repeated slowly. "That's pretty specialized knowledge for someone who processes shipping manifests." Peterson shrugged. "Army trains people for a lot of things. Maybe she had additional training somewhere along the way." But Reid was already walking away, his mind racing with possibilities that made increasing sense the more he thought about them. Elena Vasquez wasn't just a logistics officer. She was something else, something that required the kind of training that covered tactical assessment, crisis management, and specialized knowledge that went far beyond supply chain coordination. The question was what exactly she was and why she was hiding it. Over the next 3 days, Reid made it his business to pay closer attention to Elena's behavior, looking for signs he had missed, clues that would confirm his growing suspicions. He watched her during meals, noting the way she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all entrances, the way she ate efficiently while conducting subtle surveillance of everyone around her. He observed her during PT, seeing now that her physical fitness was not just adequate, but exceptional, that her movements during exercise had the kind of controlled precision that came from advanced training, that she completed every evolution without apparent effort, while others struggled with exertion. He listened to her conversations with other personnel, hearing now that her questions about base operations and personnel weren't casual curiosity but systematic information gathering, that she knew more about military procedures and protocols than someone with her supposed background should know. And most importantly, he noticed things about her that he had previously attributed to personal quirks, but now recognized as operational habits. The way she varied her routines to avoid predictable patterns, the way she positioned herself during formations to maintain escape routes, the way she processed information with the kind of focused attention that suggested training and intelligence analysis. Reid was not an intelligence analyst himself, but he had worked with enough special operations personnel to recognize certain behavioral patterns. Elena Vasquez moved through the world like someone who had been trained to operate in hostile environments, like someone accustomed to surveillance and counter-surveillance, like someone whose survival had once depended on maintaining situational awareness and operational security. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that Elena was not who she claimed to be, and the more convinced he became, the more resentful he grew about being deceived. Reid was the kind of person who took deception personally, who interpreted someone else's operational security as a personal insult to his intelligence. If Elena was hiding her true background, it meant she thought he was too stupid to figure it out. If she was pretending to be something she wasn't, it meant she didn't trust him with the truth. And if she was some kind of special operations officer slumming among regular army personnel, it meant she thought she was better than everyone else, exactly what he had suspected from their first interaction. But Reid made a critical error in his assessment. He assumed that Elena's deception was voluntary, that she was choosing to hide her background for reasons of arrogance or superiority. He never considered that her cover might be operational necessity, that revealing her true identity could compromise ongoing missions, that some people were required to remain invisible even when visibility might benefit them personally. He never considered that Elena might be exactly what she appeared to be, a logistics officer doing a routine assignment, but with additional background and training that she couldn't discuss because it was classified beyond his clearance level. Most importantly, he never considered that someone with Elena's apparent capabilities might be dangerous in ways he was not equipped to handle, that testing her might provoke responses he was not prepared for. Reid was about to make the mistake that would define the rest of his military career, confusing operational security with personal deception, interpreting professional discretion as dishonesty, deciding that someone who chose to remain invisible needed to be exposed. On Thursday evening, 3 days after the chemical incident, Reid approached Elena in the barracks corridor as she returned from her late-night workout. It was 2130 hours, well past normal duty hours, and the hallway was mostly empty except for a few soldiers heading to or from the laundry room. "Captain Vasquez!" Reid called out, his tone carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a casual encounter. Elena paused, her hand on her room door, and turned to face him. She had seen him paying increased attention to her over the past few days, had recognized the pattern of someone conducting surveillance, had prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation. "Staff Sergeant Reid," she replied, her voice neutral but alert. Reid approached slowly, stopping just close enough to violate normal conversational distance, using his physical presence to create subtle pressure. "I've been thinking about the other night, about how you knew where that contamination was going to drift, how you knew exactly what protocols to follow." Elena's expression didn't change, but internally she was calculating options, assessing threats, preparing for escalation. "Emergency procedures are part of basic military training, Staff Sergeant." Reid smiled, but there was nothing friendly in the expression. "See, that's what I thought at first. But then I started paying attention, started noticing things. The way you move, the way you process information, the way you handled that crisis situation." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than if he had been shouting. "You want to tell me what you really do, Captain? Because I'm pretty sure it's not logistics coordination." Elena held his gaze steadily, showing no reaction to his proximity or his implied accusation. I coordinate supply chain operations and equipment requisitions for multiple units across the installation. If you have specific questions about procedures or regulations, I'm happy to clarify. Reid's smile widened. That's good. That's really good. Professional, diplomatic, completely uninformative. Just like someone would sound if they were trained to deflect questions about classified activities. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always preceded moments when her two worlds collided, when the carefully maintained separation between her cover identity and her operational background threatened to collapse. She had been through this before, in other assignments, other places where people had asked questions she couldn't answer. Usually, it ended with her being quietly transferred before situations could escalate. Usually, the people asking questions were smart enough to recognize when they were approaching classified territory and backed away before forcing confrontations that would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. But Reid was not smart enough to recognize those boundaries. He was exactly the kind of person who would push until something broke, who would confuse persistence with courage, who would mistake his own ignorance for righteousness. I think you should be careful about making assumptions, Staff Sergeant, Elena said quietly, her tone carrying the first hint of warning she had allowed into her voice. Reid heard the warning and interpreted it as confirmation that he was right, that Elena was hiding something significant, that his pressure was forcing her to reveal information she preferred to keep secret. Assumptions? He repeated. Is that what I'm making, or am I just paying attention to someone who moves like special operations, thinks like intelligence, and handles crisis situations like someone who's done it before under much worse circumstances? Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Reid was not just asking questions now, he was demonstrating knowledge of military specialties and operational patterns that suggested he might actually understand what he was looking for. That made him more dangerous than she had initially assessed. I don't know what you think you've observed, she said, but I'd recommend focusing on your own responsibilities instead of speculating about mine. Reid stepped even closer, now well inside normal personal space, using his height and mass to create physical intimidation. See, that sounds like someone telling me to mind my own business. But here's the thing, Captain. When someone is lying about who they are, when someone is pretending to be something they're not, that becomes everyone's business. Elena felt her operational training engaging, threat assessment protocols activating, muscle memory preparing for possibilities she hoped wouldn't become necessary. Reid was escalating beyond conversation, beyond professional disagreement, moving into territory where mistakes became violent and reversible became permanent. Staff Sergeant, she said, her voice dropping into a tone that carried absolute authority, you need to step back and reconsider what you're doing. Reid heard the authority, and it made him angrier. She was trying to pull rank, trying to use her officer status to shut down his legitimate questions. That confirmed everything he suspected about her character. She thought rank would protect her from accountability, thought he would back down if she reminded him of the hierarchy. Or what? He said, moving even closer until he was looming over her, his chest almost touching hers. You'll write me up for insubordination? You'll report me for asking questions? You'll use your mysterious special operations connections to make problems for me? Elena was completely still now, her breathing controlled, her weight centered, her hands loose at her sides. To anyone watching, she would have appeared calm, almost relaxed. Only someone trained to recognize combat preparation would have seen the subtle shifts in her posture, the way she had positioned her feet for maximum stability and mobility, the way her hands had moved into positions that would allow instant response to physical attack. I'll give you one more chance to walk away, Staff Sergeant, she said quietly. Reid heard finality in her voice, and it triggered something in his psychology, some combination of wounded pride and institutional resentment that made him decide this was the moment to prove his point, to force Elena to drop her facade and reveal whatever she was hiding. He reached out fast, his right hand grabbing the front of her uniform shirt, his left hand moving to pin her against the door behind her. It was not intended as a serious assault. He was going to hold her, intimidate her, force her to drop the pretense of authority and admit what she really was. He never got the chance. Elena's response was instantaneous and surgical. Her left hand intercepted his grabbing wrist, controlling it with precise pressure that turned his aggressive motion into a trapped limb. Her right hand struck his elbow joint with calculated force, creating stress that would fracture bone if he continued to resist. Reid's brain registered two sensations simultaneously: complete loss of control over his right arm, and pain unlike anything he had experienced in 6 years of military service. The fracture was clean, precise, and absolutely disabling. Not the kind of break that happened accidentally during resistance training, but the kind that happened when someone with advanced hand-to-hand combat training decided to end a confrontation permanently. He opened his mouth to scream, but Elena's hand was already moving, striking a pressure point at the base of his neck that temporarily disrupted his vocal cords. The sound that emerged was a strangled gasp, barely audible beyond the immediate area. Reid collapsed to his knees, cradling his broken hand against his chest, his face white with shock and pain. Elena stood over him, breathing normally, her uniform barely rumpled from the encounter. The entire confrontation had taken less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds to transform Marcus Reid from an aggressive NCO demanding answers into a disabled soldier requiring medical attention. 3 seconds to demonstrate exactly why some people chose to remain invisible rather than reveal what they were capable of. Elena looked down at Reid for a moment, her expression unreadable, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She dialed a 3-digit extension, and when someone answered, she spoke in the calm, professional tone of someone reporting a routine incident. "This is Captain Vasquez in Barracks Delta. I need medics at my location for a soldier with a fractured hand. Non-combat injury, stable condition. And please notify the duty officer that there's been an incident requiring administrative review." She ended the call and looked back down at Reid, who was staring up at her with a mixture of pain, shock, and dawning comprehension. "You should have walked away, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. "Some questions don't have answers you're cleared to hear." The medics arrived within 4 minutes, followed closely by the duty officer, a captain named Williams who had been awakened by the emergency call and was not pleased about having to deal with an administrative incident in the middle of the night. Williams was a competent but unremarkable officer, the kind who specialized in following procedures and avoiding complications that might reflect poorly on his leadership. Elena met them in the hallway, where Reid still knelt cradling his injured hand, his face pale and slick with sweat from pain and shock. The medics went to work immediately, assessing the injury with professional efficiency while asking questions about how it had happened. "Slipped on the polished floor," Reid mumbled through gritted teeth, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Caught myself wrong, heard something crack." The senior medic, a sergeant named Torres who had seen enough combat injuries to recognize deliberate trauma, examined Reid's hand with careful attention. The fracture was clean, precise, located exactly at the point where maximum damage could be inflicted with minimal force. It was not the kind of injury that happened from slipping on a floor. But Torres was also experienced enough to know when soldiers were providing cover stories for incidents they didn't want investigated. Reid's explanation was obviously false, but if he chose to stick with it, that was between him and whatever had actually happened. Captain Williams pulled Elena aside while the medics worked, his expression mixing professional concern with obvious irritation at being dragged out of bed for what appeared to be a simple medical incident. "Captain Vasquez, I need you to walk me through what happened here." Elena's response was textbook military courtesy, precise and informative without being revealing. "I was returning from evening PT when I heard Staff Sergeant Reid call for help. When I turned around, he was on the floor holding his hand. I assessed that he needed medical attention and called for assistance." Williams nodded slowly, making notes on a small pad. "Did you witness the actual injury?" "No, sir. I only responded after he was already injured. It was not exactly a lie, but it carefully avoided mentioning the 3 seconds between Reid grabbing her uniform and Reid being on the floor with a fractured hand." Williams seemed satisfied with the explanation, which fit with the official story Reid was providing. But as the medics prepared Reid for transport to the base hospital, Torres approached Elena with a question that suggested he had noticed more than he was officially acknowledging. "Ma'am, in your assessment, did Staff Sergeant Reid seem disoriented or confused when you found him?" Sometimes head trauma can accompany fall injuries, and it might affect his recall of events. Elena looked at Torres carefully, recognizing the subtext. He was offering her an explanation for any inconsistencies in Reid's story, giving her a way to suggest that confusion rather than deliberate deception might account for gaps in his account. "He seemed coherent when I arrived," she said, "but pain and shock can certainly affect memory formation. I'd recommend a full neurological assessment to rule out any complications." Torres nodded knowingly. "Absolutely, ma'am. Standard protocol for any injury involving loss of consciousness or disorientation." Reid had not lost consciousness, and he had not been disoriented, but both medic and officer understood that suggesting those possibilities would provide medical justification for inconsistencies in his statement while avoiding questions about what had actually happened. As the medics loaded Reid onto a stretcher for transport, he made eye contact with Elena one final time. The pain medication they had given him was starting to take effect, but his gaze was still sharp, still focused, still carrying the weight of someone who had learned something he wished he could forget. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment. Elena nodded once, a small acknowledgement of the truth that would never be officially recognized. After Reid was transported and Captain Williams completed his initial incident report, Elena returned to her room expecting to find Sarah Kim waiting with questions about the commotion in the hallway. Instead, she found her roommate sitting on her bunk with a laptop computer, her expression thoughtful and slightly troubled. "Hey," Sarah said as Elena entered. "Everything okay out there? I heard someone got hurt." "Staff Sergeant Reid slipped and fractured his hand," Elena replied, beginning to change out of her PT gear. "Medics took him to get it treated." Sarah nodded, but her attention seemed focused on her laptop screen rather than the conversation. After a moment, she looked up with an expression that suggested she was weighing whether to ask a difficult question. "Elena," she said carefully, "can I ask you something? And if it's something you can't answer, just tell me and I'll drop it?" Elena paused in folding her uniform, recognizing the tone. Sarah had discovered something, learned something, figured out something that changed her understanding of who she was rooming with. "You can ask," Elena said. Sarah turned her laptop around, revealing a search results page filled with military acronyms, unit designations, and personnel databases. "I've been trying to figure out how you knew about the chemical dispersal patterns the other night. Started researching hazmat training, atmospheric modeling, emergency response protocols." She clicked through several tabs, showing increasingly specialized training programs and certification requirements. "This stuff isn't basic military knowledge. It's specialized training that takes months to complete, requires security clearances, and is only offered to personnel in specific career fields." Elena remained silent, waiting to see where the research had led. Sarah clicked to another tab showing an organizational chart for U.S. Army chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear operations. "So I started looking at what kind of units do this type of work, what kind of training they require, what kind of personnel they recruit." The chart showed multiple specialized roles, from hazmat technicians to chemical officers to specialized response teams that operated at various classification levels. Some of the positions were clearly marked as requiring top-secret clearances and specialized training that was not listed in public databases. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "most of these specialties require extended training pipelines, multiple schools, years of experience. But according to your personnel file, you've been in logistics for your entire career. No additional training, no specialized schools, no background that would explain how you knew what you knew." Elena sat down on her own bunk, facing Sarah directly. "What are you asking?" Sarah closed the laptop slowly. "I'm asking if Elena Vasquez, logistics coordinator, is the whole story. Because if it is, then you're the most naturally gifted emergency responder I've ever met. And if it's not," she left the sentence hanging, giving Elena the opportunity to fill in whatever explanation she felt comfortable providing. Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks, considering how much truth could be shared without compromising security or endangering people who didn't need to be involved in classified operations. "Some people have additional training that doesn't appear in their official files," she said finally. Some assignments require capabilities that aren't reflected in standard personnel records. Sarah nodded slowly. Need to know basis? Need to know basis, Elena confirmed. Sarah was quiet for another moment, processing the implications. Then she looked up with an expression that mixed understanding with concern. Is that why Staff Sergeant Reid has been asking questions about you? Because he figured out that your background doesn't match your assignment? Elena's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested her roommate had just identified the source of a problem she had been monitoring. Reid asks a lot of questions about a lot of people, Elena said carefully. Yeah, but tonight he was asking very specific questions about you, about your training, your background, your responses during the chemical incident, and now he's in the hospital with a broken hand. Sarah's voice was gentle but pointed, offering Elena the chance to explain without demanding answers she couldn't provide. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base lights that stretched toward the horizon. After a moment, she spoke without turning around. Sometimes people ask questions that put them in situations they're not prepared for. Sometimes curiosity becomes dangerous, not because the information itself is harmful, but because knowing certain things comes with responsibilities that not everyone is equipped to handle. She turned back to face Sarah. Marcus Reid wanted to know who I really was. Tonight he found out, and now he has to decide whether that knowledge was worth what it cost him. Sarah stared at her roommate, seeing her clearly for the first time since they had been assigned together. Not just Elena Vasquez, logistics coordinator, but someone whose real identity was classified, whose true capabilities were compartmentalized, whose presence at Fort Braxton served purposes that had nothing to do with processing shipping manifests. Are you okay? Sarah asked quietly. Elena smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Sarah had seen from her. I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Thank you for asking, and thank you for understanding that some things have to stay private. Sarah nodded, closing her laptop with finality. I never researched anything tonight. We never had this conversation, and as far as I know, Staff Sergeant Reid slipped on a polished floor. Elena's smile widened slightly. You're going to do very well in this army, Sarah. The next morning brought new complications. Reid had been treated and released from the hospital with his hand in a cast and strict orders for limited duty. His official medical record listed the injury as a fall-related fracture, but the attending physician had noted inconsistencies in the injury pattern that suggested alternative causation mechanisms might be worth investigating if additional information became available. More significantly, Reid's squad leader had been asking questions about where he had been when the injury occurred, why he had been in the barracks during off-duty hours, and whether there were any ongoing interpersonal conflicts that might have contributed to the incident. Elena learned about these developments through the base communication network that every installation maintained, the informal system of professional relationships, casual conversations, and shared information that allowed personnel to stay aware of situations that might affect them without accessing official channels. By mid-morning, she had confirmation that Reid was claiming his injury had been accidental, that he was not requesting any investigation into the circumstances, and that his chain of command was treating it as a routine medical incident requiring administrative follow-up but not disciplinary action. She also learned that Reid had requested transfer to a different barracks, citing personality conflicts with personnel in his current housing assignment. Elena processed this information with mixed feelings. Reid's request for transfer suggested he understood the situation clearly enough to want distance from it. His refusal to request investigation meant he was not interested in pursuing explanations that might require official scrutiny of classified information. His insistence on the accidental injury story indicated he preferred the cover story to the complications that truth would bring. All of this suggested that Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid had learned exactly what Elena had intended him to learn, that some people were more dangerous than they appeared, that some questions were better left unasked, and that testing someone's limits could result in discovering limits you were not prepared to encounter. But it also meant that Elena's cover had been compromised, that her operational security had been breached by someone who now carried knowledge he was not cleared for, and that her assignment at Fort Braxton had become a liability rather than an asset. She was not surprised when her secure phone rang at 13:47 hours with instructions to report to Building 648 for administrative consultation at her earliest convenience. Building 648 was officially listed as archive storage, but Elena knew it also housed secure communication facilities used by personnel whose work required compartmentalized coordination with agencies and units that did not officially interact with routine Army operations. She arrived at 1400 hours and was directed to a small conference room where two people waited, a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Ms. Crawford, and a colonel whose uniform carried no unit insignia, name tape, or identifying marks of any kind. The conversation was brief, professional, and entirely predictable. Elena's assignment at Fort Braxton was being terminated effective immediately. Her cover had been compromised through no fault of her own, but maintaining operational security required removing her from the environment before additional personnel developed suspicions about her background. She would be reassigned within 72 hours to a position that better matched her actual qualifications and security clearance. The incident with Staff Sergeant Reid would be classified and compartmentalized to prevent any administrative complications. Reid himself would be transferred to a different installation within 30 days, where his medical records would indicate a routine reassignment rather than any connection to security-related incidents. Elena accepted the briefing with professional equanimity. This was how these assignments ended, quietly, efficiently, with minimal disruption to ongoing operations and maximum protection for all personnel involved. She had accomplished her primary mission during the chemical incident, demonstrated her capabilities when lives were at risk, and maintained her cover identity until someone made the deliberate choice to compromise it through aggressive investigation. The fact that Reid had suffered consequences for his decision to push beyond appropriate boundaries was simply the natural result of choices he had made despite multiple warnings about the wisdom of continuing. As Elena walked back to Barracks Delta to collect her belongings and prepare for departure, she reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Fort Braxton as Elena Vasquez, logistics coordinator, expecting to spend several months in the kind of routine assignment that provided operational cover while she recovered from previous missions. Instead, she was leaving as someone whose identity had been partially revealed, whose capabilities had been demonstrated, and whose presence had become untenable because one person had refused to accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. But she was also leaving with something unexpected: the memory of Sarah Kim's quiet acceptance, the recognition that some people could handle partial truth better than complete deception, the knowledge that professional relationships could survive the revelation of classified backgrounds if trust and respect existed underneath the operational requirements. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the larger context of her career and mission requirements, but it mattered to Elena in ways she had not anticipated, reminding her that even people who lived in classified worlds could sometimes find genuine human connection when circumstances allowed it. She would miss Sarah Kim. She would not miss Marcus Reid, and she would carry both experiences forward into whatever assignment came next, along with the hard-earned knowledge that some people were worth trusting with partial truth, while others would always choose confrontation over wisdom, regardless of the consequences. Elena packed her belongings with the same methodical precision she had used to arrange them 2 weeks earlier. Each item was placed in her duffel bag according to weight distribution and access priority, a habit from years of assignments where departure could happen with 15 minutes' notice and everything had to be ready for immediate transport. Sarah Kim sat on her own bunk, watching the process with mixed emotions. She had known this moment was coming since their conversation the previous night, had understood that someone with Elena's background wouldn't remain in a compromised position for long, but knowing it intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were different things. "Will I see you again?" Sarah asked quietly. Elena paused in folding her uniforms, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing information that could compromise future operations. The Army is smaller than people think. If we're meant to cross paths again, we will. It was not exactly a promise, but it wasn't a denial either. Sarah nodded, understanding that it was the most definitive answer she was likely to get. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elena's hand moved instinctively toward the tactical knife she carried in her cargo pocket, a response so automatic she didn't realize she had done it until Sarah noticed the movement. "Come in," Elena called, her voice carrying the neutral tone she used when unsure about potential threats. The door opened to reveal Staff Sergeant Peterson, the NCO whose platoon Elena had redirected during the chemical incident. He stood at attention in the doorway, his uniform immaculate, his expression serious but respectful. "Ma'am, may I speak with you privately?" Elena nodded, gesturing for him to enter while Sarah gathered her things and stepped into the hallway to give them space. Peterson closed the door behind him and remained at attention until Elena indicated he should relax. "Captain Vasquez," Peterson began, his voice carrying the kind of formal respect usually reserved for interactions with senior officers. "I wanted to speak with you before you departed." Elena raised an eyebrow slightly. She hadn't announced her departure to anyone except Sarah, hadn't filed any paperwork that would indicate her assignment was ending. Peterson's knowledge of her impending transfer suggested information was moving through channels that bypassed official notification systems. "How did you know I was leaving, Staff Sergeant?" Peterson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he understood more about Elena's situation than he was officially supposed to. "Word travels fast when someone with your qualifications has their assignment status changed. People pay attention." Elena studied his face, recognizing the careful language of someone who had been briefed on classified information without being given explicit details. Peterson knew enough to understand that Elena wasn't simply a logistics officer, but not enough to compromise operational security. "What did you want to say?" Elena asked. Peterson reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in olive drab cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a unit coin, a round metal disc bearing the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division with Peterson's platoon designation engraved on the reverse. "This is from 3rd Platoon," he said, extending the coin toward Elena. "Every man in that platoon knows that you saved their lives 3 nights ago. They know that without your assessment, without your willingness to take action when leadership was working, with bad information, 36 soldiers would have walked into a chemical cloud that could have killed or permanently disabled them." Elena looked at the coin without taking it. "I followed standard emergency procedures, Staff Sergeant. Any competent officer would have done the same." Peterson shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Any competent officer would have followed orders and trusted that higher authority had better information. You looked at the situation, made an independent assessment based on specialized knowledge, and took personal responsibility for the safety of people you didn't know." He held the coin steady, waiting for her to accept it. "That's not standard procedure. That's leadership at a level most of us will never reach. My men wanted you to know that they understand the difference." Elena took the coin slowly, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was warm from Peterson's body heat, worn smooth at the edges from being carried in his pocket. Unit coins were given for exceptional performance, for actions that went beyond normal duty requirements, for moments when individual excellence contributed to unit success. "Thank you," she said simply. Peterson came to attention and rendered a perfect salute, holding it for the full 3 seconds required by military protocol. But there was something in the gesture that went beyond regulatory compliance, a recognition of authority that transcended rank structure, an acknowledgement of expertise that couldn't be measured by chevrons or bars. Elena returned the salute with equal precision, and for a moment, the small room felt charged with the kind of mutual respect that made military service meaningful despite its bureaucratic complications. Peterson lowered his hand and relaxed his posture. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." Elena nodded. "I've been in the Army for 11 years. I've worked with officers from every branch, every specialty, every level of competence. I can recognize someone who's seen action, who's operated under pressure, who knows things that don't appear in training manuals." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what you really do, and I don't need to know. But I wanted you to understand that some of us recognize excellence when we see it, regardless of what uniform it wears or what assignment it carries." Elena felt something unexpected tighten in her chest. Gratitude, not for the recognition itself, but for Peterson's understanding that recognition could be given without requiring explanation, that respect could be offered without demanding details. "I appreciate that more than you know, Staff Sergeant." Peterson nodded once more, then turned and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, looking back over his shoulder. "If you ever need anything, ma'am, and I mean anything, you can reach out to any member of 3rd Platoon. We take care of our own, and as far as we're concerned, you're one of ours." He left without waiting for a response, closing the door quietly behind him. Elena stood alone in the room, turning the unit coin over in her hands, reading the inscription that identified Peterson's platoon, feeling the weight of acknowledgement that she had never expected to receive. In most of her assignments, success was measured by invisibility, by the absence of recognition, by the ability to accomplish objectives without anyone noticing she had been there. This was different. This was 36 people who knew exactly what she had done, who understood the calculations she had made, who recognized that her expertise had prevented disaster, even if they didn't understand the source of that expertise. For someone who lived in classified worlds, whose greatest achievements could never be publicly acknowledged, the simple act of being seen and appreciated by people who had been directly affected by her decisions carried unexpected emotional weight. Sarah returned to the room a few minutes later, finding Elena sitting on her bunk with the unit coin in her palm, staring at it with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been contentment. "Good conversation?" Sarah asked. Elena looked up, her expression clearing. "Better than I expected." She slipped the coin into her cargo pocket where it would remain for the rest of her career, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most important recognition came from people who understood that not all heroes wore their qualifications on their sleeves. The transport vehicle arrived at 16:30 hours, an unmarked sedan with government plates that attracted no attention from the soldiers moving through their end-of-duty routines. Elena loaded her duffel bag into the trunk, signed the departure paperwork with the duty NCO, and prepared to leave Fort Braxton the same way she had arrived, quietly, efficiently, without drawing notice from anyone who didn't need to know she was there. But as she walked toward the sedan, she noticed clusters of soldiers gathering near the barracks entrance, not formations or organized groups, just individuals who had emerged from the building and positioned themselves where they could observe her departure. Staff Sergeant Peterson stood near the center of the group, his posture relaxed but attentive. Around him, Elena recognized faces from 3rd Platoon, soldiers whose lives she had potentially saved, who wanted to acknowledge her departure even if they couldn't express their gratitude directly. As she approached the sedan, Peterson called out in a voice that carried across the gathering crowd, "3rd Platoon, attention!" 36 soldiers snapped to attention in perfect unison, their boots striking the asphalt with synchronized precision. The sound echoed across the area like a drumbeat, sharp and unmistakable. Peterson's voice rang out again. "Present arms!" 36 hands came up in synchronized salute, held with the kind of precision that spoke to hours of practice and genuine respect. The gesture was not required by regulation, was not part of any official ceremony, was simply 3rd Platoon's way of saying goodbye to someone who had earned their gratitude in ways that couldn't be expressed through normal channels. Elena stopped beside the sedan, looking back at the formation of soldiers who stood in perfect stillness, their salutes unwavering, their faces showing the kind of serious respect reserved for moments that mattered. She came to attention and returned their salute with equal precision, holding it for the full duration required by military courtesy. But this wasn't about courtesy. This was about recognition, about acknowledgement, about the understanding that some actions created bonds that transcended official relationships. When she lowered her hand, the formation held their salutes for another beat, then lowered their arms in unison. Peterson's voice carried across the silence. "Order arms. Fall out." The formation dissolved, soldiers returning to their evening routines as if nothing had happened. But Elena could see in their faces, in the small nods they gave her as they walked past, that something significant had occurred. They had found a way to acknowledge her contribution without compromising operational security, to express gratitude without requiring explanation. Elena climbed into the sedan, her chest tight with emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel. Through the rear window, she could see Peterson standing alone near the barracks entrance, watching the vehicle pull away. He raised his hand in a small, informal wave. Not a salute, just a gesture of farewell between professionals who understood each other. She raised her own hand briefly in response, then settled back in her seat as the sedan turned onto the main road that would take her away from Fort Braxton and toward whatever assignment waited next. 2 days after Elena's departure, Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid sat in the office of Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the battalion commander whose authority extended over multiple units within the 82nd Airborne Division. Harrison was a career infantry officer with 22 years of service, the kind of leader who had built his reputation on direct communication, clear expectations, and zero tolerance for personnel problems that reflected poorly on unit readiness. Reid's right hand remained in a cast, his medical profile restricting him to limited duty until the fracture healed. His transfer request had been approved with unusual speed, suggesting that someone wanted him relocated before his presence created additional complications. But before the transfer could be finalized, Harrison had required this meeting, a standard administrative review for any soldier whose medical condition resulted from unusual circumstances that might indicate underlying issues requiring command attention. Staff Sergeant Reid, Harrison began, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone conducting official business without prejudice. I've reviewed your medical records, your transfer request, and the incident reports from your time at Fort Braxton. I need to understand exactly what happened 3 nights ago. Reid shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his broken hand throbbing despite the pain medication he'd been prescribed. He had spent 2 days rehearsing his story, refining the details to make them consistent with his official statements, while avoiding any mention of Elena's true capabilities or his own aggressive behavior. Sir, as I reported to Captain Williams, I slipped on the polished floor in the barracks corridor. Caught myself wrong, heard something crack. Captain Vasquez responded to my call for help and summoned medical assistance. Harrison consulted the file in front of him, his expression thoughtful but skeptical. The attending physician noted that your injury pattern was inconsistent with typical fall-related trauma. Can you explain what that means? Reid's throat tightened. He had hoped the medical assessment would be routine, that the attending physician would accept his explanation without detailed analysis. The fact that inconsistencies had been officially documented meant his story was being questioned at levels he couldn't control. Sir, I'm not a medical expert. I can only report what I experienced. I fell, I was injured, Captain Vasquez helped me get treatment. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Reid with the kind of penetrating assessment that came from decades of evaluating soldiers under stress. Staff Sergeant, in my experience, people request immediate transfers from assignments they've held for less than a month for one of 3 reasons: family emergency, serious personality conflicts, or situations they need to escape before they become more complicated. He paused, letting the implications settle. Your medical records show no family emergency. Your performance evaluations show no personality conflicts with supervisors or peers. That leaves the 3rd option. Reid felt sweat forming despite the air conditioning in Harrison's office. Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. Harrison opened another file, this one containing Elena's personnel records, or rather, the carefully sanitized version that was available to commanders who lacked the security clearance to access classified information about her actual background. Captain Elena Vasquez, Harrison read from the file. Logistics Coordination Specialist, transferred to Fort Braxton 2 weeks ago. Exemplary performance during the chemical incident on Tuesday night. Reassigned effective immediately for reasons listed as operational requirements. He looked up at Reid directly. 2 soldiers arrive at my installation within days of each other. One demonstrates exceptional competence during a crisis situation. The other suffers an unexplained injury and requests immediate transfer. Both are gone within 72 hours, and neither incident has a completely satisfactory official explanation. Reid's mind raced, trying to find a response that would satisfy Harrison's questions without revealing information that could lead to additional investigation. Sir, I can only speak to my own experience. I don't know anything about Captain Vasquez's background or reassignment. Harrison closed the files and leaned forward, his expression shifting from official inquiry to personal concern. Marcus, I'm going to speak to you off the record for a moment, not as your commanding officer, but as someone who's been in this army long enough to recognize when soldiers are dealing with situations that are more complicated than they appear. Reid nodded slowly, unsure where the conversation was heading. Some assignments bring us into contact with people whose backgrounds are classified, whose capabilities aren't reflected in their official records, whose presence serves purposes we're not briefed on. When that happens, the smart play is to maintain professional distance, complete your own duties, and avoid asking questions that might compromise operational security. Harrison's voice carried the weight of personal experience, suggesting he had encountered similar situations during his own career. The alternative, trying to figure out who these people really are, testing their limits, forcing confrontations, usually ends badly for everyone involved, but especially for the person who initiated the conflict. Reid felt his face flush with a mixture of shame and recognition. Harrison understood exactly what had happened, even if the official record would never reflect that understanding. "Sir, are you saying that Captain Vasquez was—" Harrison held up a hand, stopping the question before it could be completed. "I'm saying that some people operate at classification levels above our need to know, and the wise course is to respect that rather than challenge it. I'm saying that exceptional competence sometimes comes from exceptional background that we're not entitled to understand." He opened Reid's transfer orders, already signed and processed. "Your new assignment is with the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Stewart. Clean slate, fresh start, opportunity to demonstrate that you've learned from whatever experience led to your departure from Braxton." Harrison stood, indicating the meeting was concluded. But as Reid reached for the door handle, the colonel spoke one final time. "Staff Sergeant, I don't know what happened between you and Captain Vasquez, but I know you're leaving here with a broken hand and a lesson that will serve you well for the rest of your career. Some people are more than they appear to be. When you encounter them, the smart move is to show respect and keep your distance." Reid paused, his uninjured hand on the door handle, feeling the weight of Harrison's words settling over him like a judgment he couldn't escape. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. He walked out of the office and across the base for the last time, his belongings already packed, his transportation arranged, his future assignment confirmed. But as the transport vehicle carried him away from Fort Braxton, Reid found himself thinking not about his new duty station or the fresh start Harrison had mentioned, but about 3 seconds in a hallway when his understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered. Elena Vasquez had demonstrated capabilities that existed outside normal military training, had responded to his aggression with precision that spoke to specialized education in areas he didn't understand. She had controlled the confrontation completely, from beginning to end, while maintaining the kind of professional restraint that suggested extensive experience in managing situations where violence was an option but not a preferred solution. Most importantly, she had given him multiple opportunities to walk away before the situation escalated, had warned him explicitly that he was approaching dangerous territory, had treated him with more patience than he had shown her. The fracture in his hand would heal within 8 weeks. The damage to his pride and his assumptions about military hierarchy would last much longer. But potentially most valuable of all was the knowledge he would carry forward, that some questions were better left unasked, that some people deserved respect beyond what their rank insignia indicated, and that testing someone's limits could result in discovering limits that exceeded anything he was prepared to handle. Reid would never see Elena Vasquez again, would never learn what her actual assignment had been, would never understand the full scope of what he had encountered during their brief interaction. But he would remember the lesson she had taught him, and he would pass that wisdom along to younger soldiers who might otherwise make similar mistakes. Some education was worth the price of a broken hand. 6 months after Elena's departure from Fort Braxton, the lessons from her brief assignment continued to ripple through the installation in ways both obvious and subtle. The emergency response protocols had been updated based on the chemical incident, incorporating new procedures for real-time meteorological assessment and dynamic assembly area selection. The training program for logistics personnel now included enhanced crisis management modules that prepared them for situations where standard procedures might prove inadequate. But the more significant changes were human rather than procedural. Staff Sergeant Peterson had been promoted to Sergeant First Class ahead of his normal timeline, his exemplary leadership during the chemical crisis contributing to an early advancement that positioned him for increased responsibility within the 82nd Airborne. More importantly, his approach to leadership had been influenced by Elena's demonstration that expertise could exist independently of rank, that the best decisions sometimes came from people who were willing to act on specialized knowledge regardless of whether they had explicit authority to do so. Peterson now encouraged his soldiers to speak up when they noticed discrepancies, to trust their training even when it conflicted with official instructions, to understand that following orders and thinking critically were not mutually exclusive responsibilities. His platoon had developed a reputation for adaptability and independent thinking that made them valuable assets during complex operations. Sarah Kim had been selected for advanced training in secure communications, a career path that would eventually require security clearances and exposure to classified information. Her roommate experience with Elena had taught her that military service included dimensions that weren't discussed in official training, that some people carried responsibilities that exceeded their apparent positions, and that discretion was often as important as competence in determining career success. Most significantly, the culture of Barracks Delta had shifted in ways that reflected Elena's brief but memorable presence. Soldiers were more inclined to question assumptions, more willing to defer to expertise regardless of its source, more understanding that competence could come in forms that didn't announce themselves. The changes were incremental rather than revolutionary, but they accumulated over time into an environment where people were more likely to speak up during emergencies, more willing to challenge procedures when circumstances warranted, more prepared to recognize and respect capabilities that existed outside normal channels. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had been briefed on the classified aspects of Elena's assignment after her departure, receiving enough information to understand retroactively what had occurred during her time at Braxton. The briefing had reinforced his existing belief that effective command required accepting that some operations would always remain partially opaque, that good leaders learned to work with incomplete information while maintaining support for missions they might never fully understand. Harrison had also gained appreciation for the complex challenges faced by personnel who operated in classified worlds, the difficulty of maintaining cover identities, the isolation that came from being unable to share professional experiences, the psychological cost of expertise that could never be publicly acknowledged. This understanding had made him more effective in subsequent assignments when he encountered similar situations, more skilled at providing administrative support for classified operations, while maintaining appropriate operational distance, more capable of protecting personnel whose backgrounds were compartmentalized without requiring details about their actual qualifications. The ripple effects extended beyond Fort Braxton. The unit coin that Peterson had presented to Elena had become legendary within 3rd Platoon, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most important recognition came from peers who understood the value of exceptional performance even when they couldn't understand its source. When members of 3rd Platoon rotated to new assignments, they carried that story with them, the account of a logistics officer who had prevented mass casualties through specialized knowledge and decisive action, who had demonstrated that life-saving expertise could exist in unexpected forms, who had taught them that assuming someone's limitations based on their apparent role was a mistake that could prove costly. The story evolved in the telling, as military stories always did, but its core message remained consistent. Respect competence wherever you find it. Trust expertise even when you don't understand its source, and understand that some people's greatest qualifications were the ones they were least likely to discuss. For Elena herself, the assignment at Fort Braxton had provided something she hadn't expected when she accepted the logistics coordination cover position. She had arrived seeking routine duty that would provide operational camouflage while allowing her to recover from previous missions. Instead, she had discovered that even in routine assignments, opportunities existed to make meaningful differences in people's lives. The chemical incident had required her to balance operational security against immediate necessity, to weigh the risk of exposure against the certainty of preventable casualties. Her decision to act had potentially saved 36 lives, but it had also compromised her cover and ended her assignment earlier than planned. She had initially viewed this as mission failure, an inability to maintain the invisibility that successful intelligence work required. But over time, she had come to understand that some situations transcended individual mission parameters, that preventing disaster was worth temporary compromise of operational security, that being the kind of person who could make those calculations and live with their consequences was exactly why she had been recruited for specialized service in the first place. More personally significant was her discovery that genuine human connection was still possible even within the constraints of classified work. Her relationship with Sarah Kim had demonstrated that trust could exist without complete honesty, that professional relationships could survive partial revelation of classified backgrounds, that some people were capable of understanding that need-to-know basis meant protecting others rather than concealing information for personal advantage. This understanding had influenced Elena's approach to subsequent assignments, making her more willing to engage with colleagues on a human level while maintaining necessary operational boundaries, more skilled at finding ways to contribute meaningfully to unit missions without compromising classification requirements. 2 years. After leaving Fort Braxton, Elena received a secure message through intelligence community channels. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reid had been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class and assignment as a training NCO at Fort Benning, where he would be responsible for developing emergency response procedures for infantry units. The message included a note from Reid himself, cleared through appropriate security channels, that simply read, "Thank you for the education. Some lessons are worth the cost." Elena had smiled reading that message, recognizing that Reid's experience at Braxton had ultimately served its intended purpose. He had learned that assumptions about people's capabilities could be dangerous, that respect should be based on competence rather than rank or position, that testing someone's limits might reveal limits that exceeded his own ability to handle the consequences. More importantly, Reid was now positioned to pass those lessons along to soldiers who would benefit from understanding that the military included people whose backgrounds were more complex than their official assignments suggested, whose capabilities extended beyond what their position descriptions indicated, whose presence in routine assignments sometimes served purposes that would never be officially acknowledged. The fracture in Reid's hand had healed completely within 8 weeks, leaving no permanent physical damage. But the experience had created other kinds of healing. The development of wisdom, humility, and respect for expertise in forms he had never previously recognized. On the 5th anniversary of the chemical incident, Peterson organized an informal gathering for 3rd Platoon veterans who remained in contact despite assignments that had scattered them across multiple installations. The gathering was ostensibly a social event, but its real purpose was to commemorate their shared experience of being saved by someone whose identity they would never fully understand. They told the story again, as they had dozens of times over the years, refining its details while preserving its essential truth. They passed the unit coin that Peterson had given Elena, each person holding it briefly while sharing memories of that night and its aftermath. And they raised a toast to the logistics officer who wasn't, acknowledging that some people served in ways that would never be publicly recognized, whose greatest achievements would remain classified, whose impact on others' lives could only be measured by those who had been directly affected. The gathering lasted 3 hours, filled with the kind of comfortable camaraderie that came from shared experience and mutual respect. When it ended, the participants returned to their separate lives and duties, carrying forward the understanding that exceptional people existed at every level of military service, that expertise took many forms, and that some of the most important contributions came from individuals who preferred recognition to remain private. Elena never learned about that gathering, would never know that her brief presence at Fort Braxton continued to influence people and events years after her departure. That was the nature of classified work. Impact without acknowledgement, influence without recognition, success measured by outcomes rather than credit. but somewhere in the intelligence community's vast network of compartmentalized operations and classified personnel files, her performance during the chemical incident was noted and remembered. Her willingness to compromise her cover in order to prevent casualties, her ability to maintain operational discipline while demonstrating exceptional competence under pressure, her skill at managing human relationships within the constraints of classified backgrounds, all of these qualities were documented and would influence future assignment decisions. Elena Vasquez continued to serve, continued to operate in the spaces between official policy and operational necessity, continued to be the kind of person whose greatest achievements would never be publicly acknowledged. But she did so with the knowledge that even in classified worlds, human connections were possible, that professional competence could inspire lasting respect, and that some forms of recognition transcended official channels. The broken hand had healed. The lessons remained. And somewhere in the vast complexity of military service, the ripples from 3 seconds of confrontation in a Fort Braxton hallway continued to spread, touching lives and influencing decisions in ways that would never be fully traced or completely understood. Some impacts are measured in after-action reports. Others are carried forward in the wisdom, humility, and respect that people gain from encounters with excellence they never saw coming. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.